On June 4, 1942, at approximately 10:20 in the morning, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi and watched the horizon with the calm confidence of a man who believed he knew everything that mattered. He knew his 4 fleet carriers were the finest striking force in the Pacific. He knew his pilots had trained for months. He knew his battle plan, designed by the brilliant Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, was unfolding on schedule. And he knew, with the certainty of a man whose empire had not been defeated in a major fleet engagement in modern times, that the Americans had no idea he was coming. Within minutes, his flagship was ablaze. Within the hour, 3 of his 4 carriers were burning wrecks. By nightfall, the 4th would join them at the bottom of the Pacific. Nagumo had sailed into the most devastating ambush in naval history, and he never understood why. Because the answer was not waiting for him on the ocean. It was sitting in a basement 6,000 miles behind the American lines, wearing a bathrobe and slippers, and it had been reading his mail for weeks. If this story moves you, a like helps it reach others who care about these men. And if you are new here, subscribe. Nagumo was not the only Japanese officer blindsided that morning. Across the vast sweep of the combined fleet, from the battleship Yamato, where Yamamoto himself monitored the battle by radio 300 miles to the rear, to the troopships carrying 5,000 soldiers meant to invade Midway Island, the scale of the disaster produced a single unifying question. How did the Americans know? The Japanese had planned this operation in secrecy. They had changed their naval cipher just weeks before. They had dispersed their forces across thousands of miles of ocean, with a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, specifically designed to draw the American carriers north, away from the real target. Every principle of operational security had been followed, and yet the Americans had been waiting for them, not vaguely, not approximately. They had positioned their carriers at the precise point in the ocean where they could strike first. They had known the bearing from which the Japanese would approach. They had known the date. They had known the time. The Americans had not stumbled into this battle. They had set a trap, and the trap had worked with a precision that suggested something the Japanese High Command considered flatly impossible. Someone had broken their code. That assumption, the unshakable Japanese belief that their naval communications were impenetrable, is the key to everything that follows. Because the man who shattered that belief was not a fleet admiral or a famous strategist. He was a former enlisted sailor from Dayton, Ohio, who had dropped out of high school, lied about his age to join the Navy, and taught himself to think in Japanese. His name was Joseph John Rochefort. He held the rank of commander, and in the spring of 1942, working from a windowless basement that his own men called the dungeon, he did something that no Japanese intelligence officer believed any American was capable of doing. He read the unreadable. He cracked a code that the Japanese Imperial Navy had designed to be unbreakable. And then he told his admiral exactly where, exactly when, and exactly how the enemy would attack. But that story starts not at Midway and not at sea. It starts in a classroom at the Navy's Code School in Washington, nearly 20 years before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor, when a young officer with a gift for crossword puzzles was noticed by a man who collected people who thought differently. In 1925, a 25-year-old lieutenant junior grade named Joseph Rochefort was running the United States Navy's entire code-breaking desk. He had arrived there almost by accident. A fellow officer aboard the tanker USS Kuyama had noticed 2 things about Rochefort. He was extraordinarily good at crossword puzzles, and he played the card game Auction Bridge with the precise, calculating mind of a man who remembered every card that had been played. That officer recommended him for the Navy's cryptanalysis course, then run by a lieutenant named Laurence Safford, the man who would later be called the father of American naval code breaking. Safford recognized immediately what he had. Rochefort did not merely solve puzzles. He understood systems. He could look at a wall of random numbers and begin to see the architecture underneath them, the patterns that a code's designers had tried to hide. Safford spent 4 months training Rochefort in collection and the basics of cryptanalysis. When Safford went to sea, a brilliant civilian cryptanalyst named Agnes Meyer Driscoll, known in the Navy as the First Lady of Naval Codebreaking, continued his education. Rochefort later called her a first-class cryptanalyst and a sort of teacher to him. Between Safford's vision and Driscoll's rigor, Rochefort learned the trade from the two best minds the Navy had. By the time he was 25, they trusted him enough to put him in charge. But Safford also understood that breaking Japanese codes required more than mathematics. It required understanding the Japanese. So in 1929, he sent Rochefort to Tokyo. Rochefort lived in Japan for 3 years. His wife and children came with him. He studied the language, the customs, the way Japanese officers thought and wrote and gave orders. He learned not just the vocabulary of the Imperial Navy, but its habits of mind, the way a Japanese staff officer would phrase a message, the patterns of formality and indirection that shaped military communications. This dual qualification, fluent cryptanalyst and fluent linguist, was almost unheard of. Most codebreakers could not read the language they were cracking. Most linguists could not do the mathematics of cipher systems. Rochefort could do both. And that combination would prove to be the single most important weapon the United States possessed in the spring of 1942. Remember his name. Remember what he was before the Navy found him. A high school dropout from Ohio, an enlisted man who talked his way into officer country, a crossword enthusiast who became the most consequential intelligence officer of the Pacific War. In the Japanese Imperial Navy, a man with that background would never have been allowed near a cipher. The system would not have permitted it, and that difference mattered more than any battleship ever built. In early 1941, Safford sent Rochefort to Pearl Harbor to take command of Station Hypo, the Navy's Pacific Signals Intelligence Unit. Hypo was the phonetic designator for Hawaii. The unit's official name was the Combat Intelligence Unit of the 14th Naval District. Its unofficial name, the one the men who worked there used, was the Dungeon. The Dungeon was exactly what it sounded like. A windowless basement beneath the 14th Naval District Administration Building at Pearl Harbor, accessible through a locked steel door with an armed Marine standing guard outside it. No ventilation. No natural light. The fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed constantly. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, stale coffee, and the particular smell of men who had been working underground for days without leaving. The concrete floor radiated cold. The walls sweated moisture. It was the kind of room where time lost its meaning, where a man could look up from a stack of intercepts and discover that 8 hours had passed without his noticing, or that it was 3 in the morning on a day he had thought was still afternoon. Rochefort lived in that room, not figuratively. He kept a cot in his office. He worked shifts that stretched to 20 hours or more, sometimes longer. He slept when his eyes refused to focus on the columns of 5-digit groups in front of him, and then he woke and started again. Because the concrete floor chilled his feet, he took to wearing carpet slippers instead of regulation shoes. Because the basement was cold, and he spent more time there than in his quarters, he wore a burgundy corduroy smoking jacket over his uniform, a garment that became so associated with him that decades later his men still mentioned it in interviews. He looked, by any military standard, like a man who had lost interest in appearances. He had. He had lost interest in everything except the numbers on the page in front of him and the enemy fleet they described. Above his desk hung a hand-lettered sign. It read, "We can accomplish anything provided no one cares who gets the credit." That sentence defined Rochefort's character. It also, as events would prove, described the one thing the Navy's bureaucracy would refuse to give him. Nimitz himself later said of the unit, "For several months after the outbreak of the war with Japan, the very fate of our nation rested in the hands of a small group of very dedicated and highly devoted men working in the basement under the administration building in Pearl Harbor." Nimitz understood what the Dungeon was. He understood what it cost the men who worked there. And he understood, perhaps more clearly than any other flag officer in the Pacific, what those men were giving him. Rochefort handpicked his team. They were not the men the Navy's personnel system would have chosen. They were the men Rochefort wanted because he understood that code-breaking was not a bureaucratic function. It was a form of controlled obsession, and it required a particular kind of mind. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer was his chief cryptanalyst, a man the Navy would later recognize as the father of machine cryptanalysis. Dyer had pioneered the use of IBM tabulating machines, the punch-card computers of their era, to automate the grinding, repetitive work of stripping cipher layers from intercepted messages. Wesley Wright, known to everyone as Ham, was a mathematician whose ability to see patterns in numerical chaos was regarded by some as equal to Dyer's. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Finnegan was a linguist who had trained in Tokyo, a man who had survived the bombing of the battleship USS Tennessee at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and whom Rochefort had pulled from the fleet because he needed Finnegan's Japanese more than the Navy needed another line officer. Major Alva Laswell of the Marine Corps was another Tokyo-trained linguist, an expert marksman with a steady temperament that his colleagues compared to Lou Gehrig. And Lieutenant Commander Wilfred Holmes, known as Jasper, was a retired submariner recalled to duty, a man who had written submarine stories and novellas for the Saturday Evening Post under a pen name, and who brought to the dungeon a creative lateral intelligence that would produce one of the most famous deceptions of the war. There was also a group that no one had planned for. After Pearl Harbor, the battleship USS California had been damaged so badly that her crew was displaced. Among that crew were the ship's bandsmen, musicians with no ship and no immediate assignment. Rochefort brought them into Hypo, and the bandsmen turned out to be naturals. The same discipline that made a man good at reading sheet music, the patience for repetitive patterns, the ability to hold a structure in memory while processing variations, made him surprisingly effective at the grunt work of code recovery. Rochefort kept them. This was the team. A crossword enthusiast in a bathrobe, a machine obsessive, a mathematician, 2 linguists, a submarine storyteller, and a brass section from a damaged battleship. They worked in a basement that smelled like a locker room, and in the spring of 1942, they held the fate of the Pacific War in their hands. The code they were trying to break was called JN-25. The Japanese knew it as Navy Codebook D. It was the Imperial Navy's primary operational cipher, the code used to transmit orders, fleet movements, and battle plans across the entire Pacific theater. And it was, by the standards of its time, formidable. JN-25 was a 2-layer system. The first layer was a codebook containing roughly 45,000 5-digit groups, each group representing a word, a phrase, or a concept. The word attack might be encoded as a 5-digit number, the word carrier as another, the word fleet as a third. A complete message was a long string of these groups, and without the codebook, they meant nothing. But the Japanese had added a second layer on top of it, a super encipherment that made the already difficult problem nearly impossible. Each 5-digit code group was further disguised by adding another 5-digit number drawn from a separate book of random additives. The addition used a method called false addition, meaning there was no carrying between digits. Each digit was transformed independently. So the code group for carrier might be one number in the codebook, but after the additive was applied, it became an entirely different number in the transmitted message, and the additive changed with every message. To read a single intercept, the Americans first had to figure out which additive page the Japanese sender had used. Then they had to strip the additive, subtracting the random numbers to reveal the original code groups underneath. Only then could they begin the second phase, reconstructing what the code groups actually meant, which required building the codebook one recovered group at a time. Each group had to be deduced from context, from frequency of use, from comparison with other partially decoded messages that used the same group in a different setting. The work was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle where most of the pieces were missing and the picture on the box had been burned. There was an additional complication. Station Hypo had not been permitted to work on JN-25 before Pearl Harbor. The Navy's compartmentalized system assigned different code targets to different stations. Hypo had been tasked with the Japanese flag officer's code, a high-priority target that was never broken. JN-25 had been the responsibility of Station Cast on Corregidor in the Philippines and OP-20G in Washington. It was only on December 10, 1941, 3 days after the Japanese attack, that Hypo was authorized to begin attacking JN-25. They were starting late, with no prior work to build on, against a system that the other stations had been grinding at for months. The process was agonizing. Even at their best, Rochefort's team could only read small portions of any given message. Perhaps 10% of the code groups in a message might be recovered, sometimes 20. On a good day, 25. The rest had to be filled in by educated guesswork, by knowledge of Japanese communication habits, by understanding how a Japanese staff officer structured an operational order. This is where Rochefort's years in Tokyo became decisive. He could look at a partially decoded message, see fragments of Japanese phrasing, and intuit the meaning of the gaps. As Dyer later said, Rochefort could get the right answer out of a message that was only half read because he understood how the Japanese mind assembled information. He thought in Japanese. He did not translate. He understood. By May of 1942, Station Hypo was processing as many as 140 decrypted JN-25 messages per day. In the final week before Midway, the number surged to between 500 and 1,000 intercepts daily, with perhaps 10 to 25% of the code groups actually readable. It was not clean intelligence. It was not complete. The gaps were enormous, but it was enough, and what it revealed was terrifying. A massive Japanese naval operation was being assembled. The largest fleet the Imperial Navy had put to sea since Pearl Harbor. 4 fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, troopships. Over 200 warships in total. The target was designated in the Japanese messages by a 2-letter code, AF, but the intelligence went deeper than just the target designation. In the final days before the battle, Finnegan and Wright achieved a breakthrough that would prove decisive. Working through the night of May 24th into the early hours of May 25th, alongside Dyer and Rochefort, they cracked the separate date and time cipher, a garbled encipherment system the Japanese used to disguise the specific dates and times within their operational messages. By dawn on the 25th, they could read the dates. The main attack would fall on June 4th. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would come on June 3rd, designed to draw American attention north, while the main blow fell on Midway. Washington's codebreakers at OP-20G had not cracked the date cipher. This was Station Hypo's work alone. Nimitz had already been building confidence in Hypo's product. In early May, Rochefort's intelligence had contributed to the American decision to intercept the Japanese at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval engagement in history where the opposing ships never saw each other, fighting entirely through their aircraft. The Coral Sea was a tactical draw, but a strategic success. It stopped the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby in New Guinea, and it demonstrated to Nimitz that when Rochefort told him the enemy was coming, the enemy came. On May 12th, Rochefort told Leighton that the new operation building in the Japanese message traffic was, in his words, really hot. The target was AF, and this is where the story becomes a war, not between the Americans and the Japanese, but between Americans and Americans. Because Rochefort knew what AF meant, and the men in Washington who were supposed to be his partners did not agree. Rochefort had been tracking the AF designator for weeks. He had seen the letter A used consistently for locations in the Hawaiian island chain. He had intercepted a message from March in which a Japanese reconnaissance flight near Midway had referenced AF. He was certain AF was Midway. The target of the largest Japanese naval operation of the war was a tiny coral atoll at the far western end of the Hawaiian chain, 1,200 miles from Pearl Harbor. His counterpart in Washington did not believe him. The Navy's central code-breaking organization was called OP-20G. It was based in Washington and had recently been taken over by Commander John Redman, a communications officer with no training in cryptanalysis. He had replaced Captain Lawrence Safford, the very man who had originally trained Rochefort, the founder of the Navy's entire code-breaking enterprise. Safford had been pushed out. Redman's older brother, Rear Admiral Joseph Redman, was Director of Naval Communications. Together, The Redman brothers controlled the institutional structure that was supposed to coordinate all naval intelligence. They believed the Japanese target was elsewhere, possibly the Aleutians, possibly Australia, possibly Port Moresby again, possibly even the American West Coast. They labeled Rochefort uncooperative. They argued that a man sitting in a basement in Hawaii should not be making strategic intelligence assessments. He should be doing the mechanical work of recovering code additives and feeding the raw material to Washington, where properly qualified analysts, Annapolis men, credentialed men, men who understood the bureaucratic protocols of intelligence, would decide what it meant. The dispute was not just professional, it was personal and institutional. Rochefort reported his findings directly to Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, through his friend and fellow Tokyo classmate, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, who served as Nimitz's intelligence officer. This was a violation of the chain of command. In the Redman's view, all intelligence should flow upward from the field stations to Washington, be evaluated centrally, and then be distributed back down to the fleet commanders in finished form. Rochefort's direct pipeline to Nimitz made Washington irrelevant. It made the Redman brothers irrelevant, and they did not intend to accept that. The Redmans went over Nimitz's head. John Redman appealed directly to the Vice Chief of Naval Operations to have Rochefort removed, bypassing the Pacific Fleet commander entirely. The bureaucratic knife fight was happening at the same time as the intelligence battle, and Rochefort was fighting both simultaneously. His direct pipeline to Nimitz was the decision that saved the Pacific Fleet, but it was also the decision that would eventually destroy his career. But Rochefort needed proof, not for himself, not for Nimitz, who was already inclined to trust him. He needed proof for Washington, because without Washington's agreement, the resources to set the trap at Midway might not be released. The proof came from Jasper Holmes, the submarine storyteller. Holmes knew Midway. He had spent time there before the war, when the atoll still served as a stopover for Pan American Airways flying boats. He knew that Midway, a coral atoll with no natural fresh water, depended entirely on a desalination plant to provide drinking water. He proposed a deception. With Nimitz's approval, Pearl Harbor sent a message to the Midway garrison through the undersea telegraph cable, a secure line the Japanese could not intercept. The message instructed Midway's commanders to broadcast, in plain language, over an open radio channel, that their water distillation plant had broken down and that the island was running critically short of fresh water. Midway sent the broadcast. The Japanese intercepted it. And within 2 days, a Japanese intelligence message was transmitted using the JN-25 cipher, reporting that AF was short of fresh water. Rochefort had arranged for the confirmation to be reported not through Station Hypo, but through the Allied code-breaking station in Melbourne, Australia. He calculated, correctly, that Washington would find the evidence more persuasive if it came from someone other than the man they had already dismissed as a loose cannon. Melbourne forwarded the intercept with a single note. This will confirm identity AF. The ruse did not reveal to Rochefort that Midway was the target. He already knew. Its purpose was surgical. It was designed to break the resistance of the men in Washington who refused to believe him. And it worked. Now Nimitz had his confirmation. But confirmation created a new problem, because knowing where the Japanese would strike meant nothing unless he could be there first. And being there first meant gambling everything he had left. After Pearl Harbor, after the losses of the first 6 months of the war, Nimitz possessed exactly 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific. The Enterprise and the Hornet, which made up Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and the Yorktown, which had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. The Yorktown had limped back to Pearl Harbor trailing an oil slick. The Navy Yard engineers inspected her and estimated that proper repairs would take 90 days. Nimitz told them they had 3. More than 1,400 repair workers swarmed aboard the carrier. They worked around the clock for 72 hours straight, welding steel plates over bomb damage, patching ruptured fuel lines, replacing burned wiring. They did not make the Yorktown whole. They made her functional. On May 30th, less than a week before the battle, the Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor with repair crews still aboard, still welding, heading for a fight that would determine whether the Pacific War lasted 2 more years or 20. If Rochefort was wrong, if AF was not Midway, if the Japanese fleet appeared somewhere else entirely, those 3 carriers would sail into empty ocean while the real attack fell on an undefended target. The Pacific Fleet would be caught out of position, the carriers might be lost, and with them, any hope of stopping the Japanese advance before it reached Hawaii. The arithmetic was brutal. The Japanese were bringing 4 fleet carriers with 248 aircraft. The Americans had 3 carriers with roughly 230 aircraft, many of them flown by pilots with minimal combat experience. If this was a fair fight, the Japanese would win. The only American advantage was surprise, and surprise depended entirely on one thing. Rochefort had to be right. Nimitz understood the stakes. He characterized his decision not as a desperate gamble, but as a calculated risk, precisely because the intelligence was so strong. And the intelligence was not just strong, it was specific. On May 27, 1942, at the final Pacific Fleet Staff Conference before the battle, Leighton delivered one of the most precise forecasts in the history of military intelligence. He told Nimitz that the Japanese carriers would attack Midway on the morning of June 4th, that they would approach from the northwest on a bearing of approximately 325 degrees, that they would be sighted about 175 miles from Midway, and that the first sighting would occur around dawn. Nimitz acted. He positioned Task Forces 16 and 17 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher at a point northeast of Midway that the operations staff had codenamed Point Luck. The name was deliberate, or perhaps ironic, because luck had nothing to do with what happened next. Point Luck was not a guess. It was a calculated position, close enough to strike the Japanese carriers before they knew they were being watched, far enough to fall back and protect Hawaii if the intelligence proved wrong. Every mile of that positioning was built on the work of a man in a basement wearing carpet slippers. When the Japanese were sighted on the morning of June 4th, exactly where Leighton had predicted, almost exactly when he had predicted, Nimitz turned to his intelligence officer and said, with a quiet smile, "Well, you were only 5 miles, 5 degrees, and 5 minutes off." That sentence contained the highest praise an intelligence officer can receive. It meant the man in the dungeon had been right. It meant Rochefort had been right. It meant the crossword enthusiast from Dayton, Ohio, had just given the United States Navy the most valuable gift in the history of naval warfare. He had given them certainty. But certainty of the enemy's position is not the same as victory. What happened on the morning of June 4th required something beyond intelligence. It required sacrifice of a kind that remains, more than 80 years later, almost impossible to comprehend. The American attack on the Japanese carriers began badly. The torpedo bomber squadrons launched from all 3 carriers found the Japanese fleet and attacked in successive waves, flying low, slow, and straight. The only approach that gave their obsolete Mark 13 torpedoes a chance of hitting anything. They had no fighter escort. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, dozens of fast, agile Zero fighters, fell on them like a hammer. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, attacked first. Waldron was a South Dakota native, reportedly of Sioux ancestry, who had told his men the night before that he expected the enemy would be northwest of where the official navigation plot predicted, and that if the squadron had to choose between following the group commander and following Waldron, they should follow him. He was right. He found the carriers. And he led his 15 Devastator torpedo bombers straight into the teeth of the Japanese defenses. Every single aircraft was shot down, not a single torpedo hit. Of the 30 aircrew who flew with Waldron that morning, 29 were killed. Ensign George Gay was the sole survivor. Shot down after dropping his torpedo, he floated in the ocean for more than 30 hours, hiding under a seat cushion to avoid being strafed by Japanese fighters, and watched the carriers burn. The other torpedo squadrons fared little better. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, lost 9 of 14 aircraft. Lindsay himself was killed. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, lost 11 of 13. Massey was killed. In less than an hour, the American torpedo bomber force had been effectively destroyed. Not a single torpedo had struck a Japanese ship. By every measure, the Japanese understood. The battle was going exactly as planned. Their carriers were untouched. Their fighters had annihilated the attackers. Nagumo's chief of staff later recalled that the mood on the bridge of the Akagi was one of satisfied confidence. But the torpedo bombers had done something that neither they nor the Japanese realized at the time. They had pulled every Zero fighter down to sea level. The combat air patrol, which should have been stacked at multiple altitudes to guard against attack from above, was concentrated low, chasing the last of the torpedo planes through the waves. The sky above the Japanese carriers, at 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 feet, was empty. At 10:20 that morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the dive bomber group from the Enterprise, arrived over the Japanese fleet. He had almost missed them. His squadron had flown to the expected intercept point and found nothing. Fuel was running low. McCluskey made the decision to continue searching rather than turn back, and then he saw a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, racing northward at full speed, leaving a white wake across the blue ocean. McCluskey followed the wake. It led him straight to the carriers. Nearly simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie's dive bomber group from the Yorktown arrived from a different bearing. What happened next took roughly 5 minutes. The American Dauntless dive bombers, almost unopposed because the Zeros were still low on the water, pushed over into their dives and plunged toward the Japanese flight decks. McCluskey's group split between the carriers Kaga and Akagi. When a communications confusion sent most of his bombers onto the Kaga, Lieutenant Richard Best, whose section had been assigned to the Akagi, saw the mix-up, broke off with his 2 wingmen, and dove on Nagumo's own flagship. Best put a single 1,000-pound bomb through the flight deck and into the hangar, where fueled and armed aircraft were being prepared. That one hit was enough. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship as her own ordnance detonated. Leslie's group hit the Soryu with equal precision. In 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were mortally wounded. The fires could not be controlled. The explosions from their own ordnance tore them apart from the inside. All 3 would sink by the following day. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu, survived long enough to launch 2 counterstrikes that crippled the Yorktown. But that afternoon, American scouts found the Hiryu, and a final dive bomber attack set her ablaze as well. She sank the following morning. The Yorktown, taken under tow, was torpedoed by the Japanese submarine 1168 and sank on June 7th. The Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers, the heavy cruiser Mikuma, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 men, including irreplaceable pilots and aircraft mechanics, who could never be replaced at the pace the war now demanded. The United States Navy, outnumbered, outgunned, sailing with patched-together ships and half-trained air groups, had just won the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar. And every pilot who dove on those carriers, every torpedo bomber crew that died in the water, every sailor on every ship at Point Luck, owed their chance to fight that battle to a man they had never met, working in a room they would never see, reading messages they would never know existed. Now consider what the Japanese were looking at, and why they could not understand it. The Imperial Navy's assumption about the security of its communications was not merely confident, it was absolute. The Japanese believed their cipher systems were unbreakable. This was not arrogance born of ignorance. JN-25 was, by the technical standards of the era, an excellent code. The 2-layer encipherment, the enormous codebook, the regularly changed additive tables, and all represented sophisticated cryptographic design. Japanese signals officers had tested the system against their own cryptanalysts and concluded it could not be read by an outsider. But the problem went beyond the cipher. The entire Japanese approach to Midway was saturated with overconfidence. Nagumo's own pre-battle estimate of the situation, the formal intelligence assessment prepared by his staff and distributed to the fleet before sailing, contained an assumption so revealing it deserves to be quoted. The estimate assessed that the enemy, meaning the Americans, was unlikely to offer serious resistance and would only mount a counterattack after Japanese landings on Midway were already underway. The American carriers, Nagumo's staff assessed, were probably still in the South Pacific, far from the battle area. There was, in the Japanese estimation, no realistic possibility of an American ambush because the Americans did not know an attack was coming and would not have the audacity to challenge the combined fleet, even if they did. This assessment was wrong in every particular. The Americans knew they were not in the South Pacific. They were waiting at Point Luck, northeast of Midway, in precisely the position where they could strike first, and they had not merely the audacity to challenge the combined fleet. They had the intelligence to do it on their own terms. The Japanese had also failed in their own reconnaissance. Yamamoto had ordered a line of submarines positioned between Pearl Harbor and Midway to detect any American carrier sortie, but the submarines arrived on station too late. Nimitz's carriers had already passed through the patrol line before the Japanese boats were in position. The one early warning system the Japanese had deployed was watching an empty ocean. The Japanese were blind because their own assumptions had made them so. And the instrument of their blindness was a man they did not know existed, working in a room they could not have imagined, reading messages they were certain no one could read. What they did not test, because they did not imagine it, was the possibility that the outsider might understand Japanese. This was the philosophical wall that the Japanese could not see, let alone climb over. Their cipher security was built on the assumption that cryptanalysis was purely mathematical, that an enemy codebreaker would approach JN-25 as a problem of numbers, of statistics, of pattern recognition applied to anonymous 5-digit groups. And against a purely mathematical attack, JN-25 was strong, but Rochefort did not attack it purely mathematically. He attacked it linguistically. He knew how Japanese naval officers constructed operational messages. He knew the formalities, the hierarchies of address, and the predictable phrases that opened and closed routine communications. He knew that a message from a certain type of headquarters to a certain type of subordinate command would follow a structural pattern as rigid as a sonnet. And those patterns gave his team the entry points they needed to strip the additives and begin reading the code groups underneath. The Japanese never tested for this because their own intelligence culture did not produce men like Rochefort. In the Imperial Navy, code breaking was a technical function performed by specialists. It was not integrated with linguistic and cultural expertise the way Rochefort had integrated it at Station Hypo. A Japanese cryptanalyst might be a superb mathematician. He would not also be a man who had lived in America for 3 years, learned to think in English, and absorbed the cultural logic of American military communication. That combination did not exist in the Japanese system, and because it did not exist in theirs, they did not imagine it could exist in anyone else's. They projected their own limitations onto their enemy. And that projection, that failure of imagination, cost them 4 aircraft carriers and the initiative in the Pacific War. But there is a deeper layer still, the one that explains not just why the Japanese code was broken, but why the man who broke it was allowed to exist at all. Rochefort was what the Navy called a Mustang, an officer who had risen from the enlisted ranks. He had no degree from the Naval Academy at Annapolis. He had no family connections to the naval establishment. He had entered the service as an enlisted teenager who lied about his age, and he had risen through a combination of raw ability and the willingness of a few senior officers to look past credentials and see talent. In the peacetime Navy, men like Rochefort were tolerated but rarely celebrated. The officer corps was built on Annapolis, on pedigree, on a culture that valued institutional belonging as much as individual brilliance. Rochefort did not belong to that culture. He belonged to the problem in front of him. His loyalty was to the work, not to the hierarchy, and that distinction would define both his triumph and his punishment. Because the same system that allowed a high school dropout to become the most important intelligence officer in the Pacific was also a system that contained men who believed intelligence should flow upward through proper channels, be evaluated by properly credentialed analysts in Washington, and be delivered to commanders in a format that preserved the authority of the chain of command. Rochefort violated every one of those beliefs. He made his own assessments. He reported directly to Nimitz through Leighton, bypassing Washington entirely. He argued with his superiors. He refused to defer to men he considered wrong, regardless of their rank. And he was right. That was the part Washington could not forgive. After Midway, Admiral Nimitz recommended Rochefort for the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. The recommendation was blocked. Not by the Japanese. Not by the enemy. By Captain Joseph Redman and Commander John Redman, the brothers who ran naval communications, and OP-20G, the same men who had insisted AF was not Midway, who had argued the attack would come elsewhere, who had been proven catastrophically wrong. The Redmans persuaded Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, that Washington's codebreakers deserved the credit for Midway, not the rogue in the basement at Pearl Harbor. King, who had his own reasons for distrusting officers who operated outside the chain of command, agreed. The medal that Nimitz had recommended was quietly killed. But the Redmans were not finished. In the autumn of 1942, Rochefort was removed from Station Hypo. The official explanation involved a routine rotation of personnel. The reality was a bureaucratic execution. He was not given another intelligence assignment. He was not sent to a fleet staff where his skills could have continued to shape the war. He was given command of a floating dry dock, ABSD-2, in San Francisco, a dry dock, a facility for repairing the hulls of ships. The man who had made Midway possible, who had given the United States Navy the most important victory of the Pacific War, who had been right when every senior official in Washington had been wrong, was sent to supervise metal patches and bottom paint. He never returned to code breaking during the war. He never returned to operational intelligence. The system had decided that being right was less important than being obedient. And Rochefort had never been obedient. When Nimitz tried to push the medal through again, Rochefort himself told the admiral not to bother. It would only make trouble. That sentence captures the man as completely as any biography could. He did not want to fight the institution. He wanted to fight the enemy. The institution had decided they were the same thing. He received the Legion of Merit at the end of the war, a lesser decoration whose citation said nothing about his work at Midway. He went on to head the Pacific Strategic Intelligence Group in Washington during the final months of the conflict. He retired as a captain. He kept his silence for the rest of his life. The work at Station Hypo was classified, sealed behind walls of secrecy that would not begin to crack for decades. Rochefort could not tell the public what he had done, and he would not have wanted to. The sign above his desk had meant what it said. He cared about the work, not the credit. He died of a heart attack on July 20th, 1976, in Torrance, California. He was 76 years old. The injustice did not end with his death. It began to be corrected because of it. A retired rear admiral named Donald Showers, who had served under Rochefort at Station Hypo as a young ensign, joined forces with historians and former colleagues to document what had actually happened in the dungeon in the spring of 1942. They collected testimony. They declassified records. They wrote letters and made phone calls and pushed against the institutional inertia of a navy that had spent 4 decades pretending the credit belonged to Washington. The campaign took nearly a decade. But on May 30th, 1986, 44 years after the Battle of Midway, President Ronald Reagan stood in the Roosevelt Room of the White House and presented the Navy Distinguished Service Medal to Rochefort's son and daughter, Joseph Rochefort Jr. and Janet Rochefort Ellading. Senior military and intelligence leaders filled the room. The ceremony lasted only minutes, but it contained, in its quiet formality, an admission that the United States Navy had spent 4 decades denying credit to the man who had saved its Pacific Fleet. Now look at the full shape of what happened, and see why the Japanese never saw it coming. They did not see it coming because they could not see the man who made it possible, not because he was hidden. Because he was invisible to them by design, Their own system would never have produced a Rochefort, a high school dropout running a cipher unit, an enlisted man-turned-officer, a maverick who reported outside the chain of command, a man who wore a bathrobe to work and slept in his office and trusted bandsmen from a damaged battleship to help break an unbreakable code. In the Japanese Imperial Navy, every one of those details would have been disqualifying. The dropout would not have been admitted. The enlisted man would not have been promoted. The maverick would have been disciplined. The bathrobe would have been confiscated, and the bandsman would have been sent to play music, which is what bandsmen were for. The Japanese assumed their code was secure because they measured its security against the kind of adversary their own system would have produced. A technically competent, institutionally obedient, narrowly specialized analyst who would attack the cipher as a mathematical abstraction. Against that adversary, JN-25 was strong. But the adversary who actually came for them was a creature their system could not have imagined. A man who combined mathematics and language and intuition and cultural understanding into a single act of comprehension. A man whose team was assembled not by the personnel system but by one officer's instinct for talent. A man who operated not within the bureaucracy but around it, through it, and when necessary, against it. The Japanese lost at Midway because they were blind. But they were not blind because their reconnaissance failed, although it did fail. They were not blind because their submarines arrived on station too late, although they did arrive too late. They were not blind because the scout plane from the cruiser Tone launched behind schedule, although it launched behind schedule. They were blind because they were certain they could not be seen. And certainty, when it is wrong, is the most dangerous condition a military force can carry into battle. It is worse than ignorance, because an ignorant man at least knows he does not know. A certain man does not even ask the question. Admiral Yamamoto himself had understood this danger, at least in the abstract. Before the war, speaking to the Japanese Prime Minister in 1940, he had said that if ordered to fight, he would run wild for the first 6 months or a year. But he had added that he had utterly no confidence for the second or third year. June of 1942 was nearly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The wild run was over, and the instrument of its ending was not a weapon the Japanese had anticipated. It was not a new ship, a new aircraft, a new torpedo. It was a man in a basement who had taught himself to read their thoughts before they acted on them. Rochefort once described his philosophy of intelligence in a single sentence that captured everything he believed. He said, "An intelligence officer has one task, one job, one mission. This is to tell his commander, his superior, today, what the enemy is going to do tomorrow. If he does not do this, then he has failed." He did not fail. He told Nimitz what Nagumo was going to do. He told him where. He told him when. He told him how many carriers, how many aircraft, what bearing they would approach from, and what time they would be sighted. And Nimitz, to his everlasting credit, believed him. Not because the evidence was overwhelming. In truth, the evidence was fragmentary, incomplete, built from partially decoded messages and informed guesswork. Nimitz believed him because he had learned to trust the man behind the evidence. He had learned that Rochefort's instinct, honed by years of living inside the Japanese language and the Japanese military mind, was more reliable than the confident pronouncements of credentialed analysts in Washington who had never set foot in Japan. That trust, the decision of one admiral to believe one codebreaker over the institutional consensus of the Navy's own intelligence bureaucracy, was the fulcrum on which the Pacific War turned. Without it, the carriers would not have been at Point Luck. Without it, McCluskey would not have been in the air. Without it, Best would not have put his bomb through the deck of the Akagi. Without it, Waldron and his men would have died for nothing, because there would have been no dive bombers arriving 5 minutes behind them to finish what their sacrifice had made possible. The Japanese spent the rest of the war trying to understand what had gone wrong at Midway. Their post-war accounts, most famously the memoir by Commander Mitsuo Fuchida and Masatake Okumiya, published in the 1950s, framed the defeat as a matter of bad luck. Fuchida, the airman who had led the Pearl Harbor strike and was present aboard the Akagi at Midway recovering from an appendectomy, constructed a narrative that became the dominant story of the battle for half a century. He wrote of 5 fateful minutes in which everything went wrong at once. The carriers, he claimed, were on the verge of launching a full strike against the American fleet. Their decks were loaded with planes armed and fueled. 5 more minutes, and those planes would have been in the air, and the battle's outcome would have been reversed. It was a narrative designed to make the defeat seem like a cruel trick of timing, rather than a failure of intelligence and command. Modern historians have demonstrated that this account was deliberately falsified. Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, in their landmark study Shattered Sword, published in 2005, used Japanese-language primary sources, including the post-war admissions of 1st Air Fleet Staff Officer Tadakazu Yoshioka, to show that the carriers were not poised 5 minutes from launching a decisive strike. The rearming timeline was more complex. The decision-making on the Akagi's bridge was marked by confusion and indecision, not by confident preparation interrupted by bad luck. Fuchida had participated in what amounted to a deliberate post-war effort among select Japanese staff officers, an understanding among them to recast the defeat as misfortune rather than incompetence. The fateful 5 minutes became a shield behind which the real failures, the failure to imagine their code had been broken, the failure to scout adequately, the failure to plan for the possibility that the enemy might be waiting, could be hidden from public scrutiny. The Japanese military leadership was brilliant at executing plans. They were less capable of imagining that their assumptions might be wrong, and at Midway, their most fundamental assumption, that their communications were secure, was the one that killed them. But the Japanese never fully confronted the intelligence failure, because confronting it would have required admitting that their cipher had been broken, and that admission carried implications that went far beyond Midway. If JN-25 was compromised, then every operation planned using it had been visible to the enemy. Every movement, every deployment, every tactical decision transmitted by radio had been readable. The scale of the vulnerability was so vast that acknowledging it would have called into question the entire structure of Japanese naval communications, so they did not acknowledge it. They clung to the belief that their codes were secure, a belief they maintained throughout the war, even as the Americans continued to read their messages and continued to position forces with a precision that should have made the answer obvious. The sheep remained blind because they could not afford to see. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8's attack from the Hornet, was pulled from the ocean by a PBY Catalina flying boat after floating for more than 30 hours. He had hidden under a black rubber seat cushion to avoid being strafed by Japanese fighters as they swept the water for survivors. From the surface of the Pacific, alone, wounded in the arm and leg, he had watched the Japanese carriers burn. He was taken to Pearl Harbor, where he confirmed to Nimitz the destruction of the carriers he had witnessed from the sea. He appeared on the cover of Life magazine in August of 1942, the first public face of the Midway victory. He survived the war, served a second combat tour in the Pacific at Guadalcanal, and returned to civilian life. He became a pilot for Trans World Airlines. He lived until 1994. He never knew, during the battle itself, that the reason he had been sent to that precise point in the ocean, the reason Waldron had found those carriers, the reason 30 men had died in the water around him, was because a codebreaker in a basement had read the enemy's mail and told an admiral where to send the fleet. Lieutenant Richard Best, the pilot who put his bomb into the flight deck of the Akagi, and who is credited with one of the hits on the Hiryu that afternoon, becoming one of only 2 pilots in the history of naval aviation to strike 2 enemy carriers in a single day, was forced to retire from the Navy after the battle. A defective oxygen rebreather in his Dauntless dive bomber had overheated during the long morning flight, releasing caustic fumes of sodium hydroxide that seared his lungs. The chemical damage activated a latent tuberculosis infection that had been dormant in his body for years. He spent 2 years in a naval hospital. He never flew in combat again. He never knew, until decades later when the intelligence was declassified, the full story of how the Navy had known where to send him. He lived until 2001, long enough to learn the truth about the man in the dungeon who had made his dive possible. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, captured the strategic significance in a single assessment. Writing in a confidential letter in 1944, he said that as a result of cryptanalysis, the United States had been able to concentrate its limited forces to meet the Japanese naval advance on Midway, when it almost certainly would have been some 3,000 miles out of place. 3,000 miles. That was the distance between being at Point Luck and being nowhere useful. That distance was closed by a codebreaker in a bathrobe. Rochefort never talked about what he had done. He was not allowed to. But if he had been asked, if the classification had been lifted, and the credit given, and the question put to him plainly, the answer would have been the same sentence he had lived by since the day he entered that basement. An intelligence officer has one job. Tell the commander what the enemy will do tomorrow. He did his job. And because he did, 4 Japanese carriers burned, the tide of the Pacific War turned, and a victory that should have been impossible became inevitable. Joseph Rochefort is interred at Inglewood Park Cemetery in California. No national cemetery, no monument, no eternal flame. The sign above his desk in the dungeon is gone. The basement itself has been repurposed. The men who worked with him are nearly all gone now. But the principle they proved, that a small team of brilliant, unconventional, fiercely dedicated people, working in obscurity, trusting their own judgment against the weight of institutional resistance, can change the course of history. That principle survives. The Japanese never saw Midway coming. Now you know why. It was not luck. It was not accident. It was a man in a bathrobe, reading the enemy's mail in a room with no windows, telling his admiral what was going to happen tomorrow, and his admiral believed him. Thank you for spending these minutes with these men. If this story reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not subscribed, now is a good time. And the bell ensures you never miss one of these. I would love to hear where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor you grew up hearing stories from, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the ones you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.